Lecture 1. November 9th, 1965. The Concept of Contradiction Notes. Begun on October 25th, 65. The Special Relationship of Research and Teaching. The lecture course derived from work in progress. Plan. Introduction to the concept of a negative dialectics transition to negative dialectics, from a critique of present-day philosophy, especially the ontological approach. Some categories of a negative dialectics. What is meant by negative dialectics? The dialectics not of identity, but of non-identity, not the triadic form, too superficial. In particular, the emphasis on the so-called synthesis is absent. Dialectics refers to the fiber of thought, the inner structure, not an architectonic pattern. Basic conception. Structure of contradiction. In a twofold sense. The contradictory nature of the concept, that is the concept in contradiction to the thing to which it refers. Explain. What is missing in the concept and in what respect it is something more. Contradiction equals discrepancy. But with the emphatic sense of concept, this becomes contradiction. Contradiction in the concept, not merely between concepts. The contradictory character of reality, model, antagonistic society. Explain life plus catastrophe. Today society survives by means of what tears it apart. This twofold character is no miracle. It shall have to be shown that the elements that shape reality in an antagonistic fashion are those that predispose the mind, the concept, to a state of antagonism. The principle of the mastery of nature intellectualized to the point of identity. This implies that dialectics is no arbitrary invention, no worldview. My task will be to demonstrate the rigor of the dialectical method. That is what this is really all about. Two versions of dialectics, idealist and materialist. So why negative dialectics? The expert objection, negation, the dialectical salt. Cite the preface to Phenomenology of Spirit, 13. Subject. Thought itself is initially the simple negation of the given. All dialectics are negative. If so, why use the term? Tautology. November 9th, 65. Transcript of the lecture. Dear colleagues, a few weeks ago, Paul Tillich died. He had occupied the only chair in philosophy at this university from 1929 to 1933. In other words, until we were all driven out by Hitler. It is not my place, nor am I entitled, to speak about the subject that was crucial to both the life and the work of my late friend Paul Tillich, namely theology. Arrangements have been made for Professor Philip to give a public lecture on his work. I do not wish to make use of this hour, or a significant part of it, to speak about Tillich. I believe that I am relieved of that necessity by the fact that it is our intention to devote the first hour of the Senior Philosophy Seminar, that is the first session next Thursday, to the relationship between philosophy and theology, and in particular, to focus on the problems that were of importance to Tillich. Nevertheless, I think I owe it to you and also to myself to say that Paul Tillich, who I am sure is no more than a name to many of you, was one of the most extraordinary people I have ever met in my life, and I owe him the most profound debt of gratitude for having approved of my habilitation thesis in 1931. In other words, at a time when fascism, with all that this meant, was on the rise. It is a debt such as I owe to few others. Had he not exerted himself on my behalf, something he did despite the differences in our respective theoretical points of view, differences that we frankly declared to one another from the very outset, it is very questionable whether I would be able to speak to you today. It is even questionable whether I would have survived. This is no mere private reminiscence, but something integral to Tillich's unprecedented and truly unique qualities of character. An openness, an open-mindedness, such as I have never encountered in anyone else. I am fully aware that precisely these qualities in Tillich provoked criticism, and I myself was among those who made such criticisms early on. But I should like to take the opportunity to say here and now that Tillich's liberal-mindedness set an example of enduring worth. This is because his almost boundless willingness to entertain every intellectual experience, and I know of no one who could equal him in this respect, combined a genuinely irenic temperament with the greatest resoluteness in his personal conduct. His extraordinary charisma went hand in hand with what can only be called leadership qualities. It goes without saying that the National Socialists made overtures to him, and I know as a fact that they did so. As late as the summer of 1933, when we spent time together in Rügen, he told me a good deal about these matters. He unhesitatingly rejected all such temptations, although they must have appeared tempting even to him. His open-mindedness did not prevent him from drawing the necessary conclusions when what was at stake was the need to show whether or not he was a decent human being, and in that particular historical context, the plain statement that a person is a decent human being gains an emphasis that it perhaps does not otherwise possess. If I may say a few more things about Tillich, particularly at the beginning of these lectures which are attended by so many young people, I do so because I am mindful of his gifts as a teacher, gifts that are related to his open-mindedness. I do not exaggerate when I say that I have never seen a man with greater pedagogic gifts than his. In particular, thanks to the boundless humanity with which he treated students' reactions, he was able to draw the maximum out of very modest and even minimal abilities. If one had the opportunity to be present at Tillich's seminars, and I was unofficially his assistant for a number of years before I became a private dozent, one had the feeling that the way he conducted himself with young people went some way towards anticipating a situation in which the usual distinctions of ability, intelligence, and so on were of no account. It was as if these distinctions were somehow negated by actual human contact, so that even a limited and repressed mind could blossom in a way that has been almost entirely ruled out everywhere nowadays. I should like to add that whatever I have myself acquired in the way of pedagogic expertise, and whatever may have encouraged you to place some confidence in me, namely this ability to encourage the growth of objectivity in other people's minds, as far as that is possible, and to achieve a meeting of minds, that whatever of this I have learned, even though I am very aware how far I lag behind Paul Tillich in this respect, I owe to him and the years of our seminars and junior seminars together. You may take my word for it that not only are there very few people who have meant so much to me, but that I attribute an influence to them that far surpasses anything that is contained in their writings. Tillich belongs in the ranks of those thinkers who give far more through personal acquaintance and living initiative than is to be found in their writings. And you who have not known him, or have perhaps only seen him once or twice in one of our joint discussions, will really struggle to form any conception of this. I would be grateful if you would all stand out of respect for Paul Tillich. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you are aware that the traditional definition of a university calls for the union of teaching and research. You know likewise just how problematic it can be to achieve the fulfillment of this idea, despite the fact that it is still generally upheld. My own work has had to suffer a great deal from this situation. The quantity of teaching and administrative chores that I have gradually accumulated render it almost impossible to continue with my research during term time. If indeed we can speak of research in connection with philosophy, with the diligence that is not only objectively indicated, but would above all reflect my own inclination and disposition. In such a situation, and given such compulsion and pressure, one tends to develop qualities that are best described by the words peasant cunning. My solution to this problem, one that I have had recourse to during the last 2 semesters and shall do so again this semester, is to take the material for my lectures from a voluminous and somewhat burdensome book that I have been working on for 6 years now with the title Negative Dialectics, the same title I have given to this lecture course. I am very aware that objections may be raised to this procedure, in particular those of a positivist cast of mind, will be quick to argue that as a university teacher my duty is to produce nothing but completed, cogent, and watertight results. I shall not pretend to make a virtue of necessity, but I do believe that this view does not properly fit our understanding of the nature of philosophy, that philosophy is thought in a perpetual state of motion, and that, As Hegel, the great founder of dialectics, has pointed out, in philosophy, the process is as important as the result. That, as he asserts in the famous passage in the Phenomenology, process and result are actually one and the same thing. Moreover, I believe that what characterizes philosophical thinking is an element of the tentative, experimental, and inconclusive, and this is what distinguishes it from the positive sciences. Not the least of the tasks I propose in this course of lectures is to explore this question. In consequence, what I shall present to you here are reflections which will retain this experimental quality until, insofar as my own energies will allow it, they have acquired their appropriate linguistic form, their definitive shape. And I can only encourage you, I'm reminded here once again of Paul Tillich, to think your own way through what I have to say to you, and to assemble your own ideas on the subject, rather than for me to transmit definite knowledge for you to take home with you. The plan that I have in mind is roughly as follows. I tell you this as a guide to finding your way around these perhaps rather convoluted lines of thought. I should like to introduce you to the concept of negative dialectics as such. I should like then to move on to negative dialectics in the light of certain critical considerations drawn from the present state of philosophy. I should like, in short, to unpack the idea of a negative dialectics and to present it in all its rigor, as far as I am able. I should then like to give you some of the categories of such a negative dialectics. Perhaps I should add that, in external, crudely architectonic terms, the plan I envisage corresponds roughly to a methodical account of what I do in general. In other words, what you will find here are some of the fundamental ideas that you will find repeated in very many other studies with different material, with different subject matter. I should like simply to try and answer the question that must have occurred to those who are familiar with my other writings. How does he actually arrive at this? What is at the bottom of all this? I want to try and put my cards on the table insofar as I know what my own cards are, and insofar as any thinker knows what cards he holds. Such things are not as obvious as you might imagine. On the other hand, and this too is a matter I shall treat in the course of these lectures, what I have just outlined is made difficult and even problematic by the fact that I do not recognize the usual distinction between method and content. In particular, I maintain that so-called methodological questions are themselves dependent upon questions of content. A feature of the themes we shall be discussing is that you may well become confused about the customary distinctions that you have learnt in your subject disciplines, which are in the habit of placing method on the one side and subject matter on the other. Now I should probably start by anticipating my entire enterprise and telling you what I mean by the concept of negative dialectics, and I should do so in a manner that calls for a resolution of the issues it raises. A rather meager, formal definition is that it sets out to be a dialectics not of identity, but of non-identity. We are concerned here with a philosophical project that does not presuppose the identity of being and thought, nor does it culminate in that identity. Instead, it will attempt to articulate the very opposite, namely the divergence of concept and thing, subject and object, and their unreconciled state. When I make use of the term dialectics, I would ask you not to think of the famous triadic scheme of thesis, antithesis, antithesis, and synthesis, in the usual sense as you encounter it in the most superficial account of school dialectics. Hegel himself, who after all did possess something like a system that aspired as a system to be a synthesis, did not adhere consistently to this scheme. In the preface to the Phenomenology, which I have already referred to, he has spoken of this creaking triadic scheme with utter contempt. In particular, and to anticipate my discussion of what I believe to be a crucial issue, you will find that in negative dialectics, the concept of synthesis is very much reduced in importance. I can only explain this here in linguistic terms, namely with reference to my deeply rooted aversion to the term, an aversion I have felt ever since I started to do any thinking at all. And since philosophical thinking consists essentially in reflecting on one's own intellectual experiences, you may perhaps have seen my notes on philosophical thinking in the Neue Deutsche Hefte, in which I discuss this One motif of such a negative dialectics is to try to find out why I resist the concept of synthesis so strongly. A further motif is that my oldest independent, that is non-interpretative, piece of philosophical writing, one that has not survived, was concerned with a logic of disintegration. This may be regarded as an alternative, albeit rather more pretentious title for such a negative dialectics. So when I speak here of negative dialectics, I would urge you to be clear in your minds that what I mean by it is not this superficial skeletal format, but the very fiber of thought, its inner structure, the way in which, as Hegel used to express it, the concept moves towards its opposite, the non-conceptual. That is what you should be on the lookout for, and not a kind of intellectual scaffolding that in fact you will seek in vain. Nevertheless, what I intend to present to you as negative dialectics possesses something quite crucially related to the concept of dialectics in general. And this is something I wish to clarify at the outset. It is that the concept of contradiction will play a central role here, more particularly, the contradiction in things themselves. Contradiction in the concept, not contradiction between concepts at the same time. And I'm sure that you will not fail to see that this is in a certain sense the transposition or development of a Hegelian motif. The concept of contradiction has a twofold meaning. On the one hand, as I have already intimated, we shall be concerned with the contradictory nature of the concept. What this means is that the concept enters into contradiction with the thing to which it refers. I should like to demonstrate this to you quite simply, in a way that perhaps some of you will think almost childish. However, my intention is merely that our discussions should not cause you to lose touch with simple, straightforward realities. For even though I believe that thinking involves raising oneself above primitive things, an essential part of thought is that it should remain in touch with immediate experience. So what I mean here, and in the first instance I am speaking of the concept, and of what is meant specifically by the concept in dialectics, that is something that we shall have to discuss. The fact is that I am not talking about concept in the ordinary sense, but about concept that is already theory. But if you will allow me to illustrate this, I can put it all quite simply. If I subsume a series of characteristics, a series of elements, under a concept, what normally happens is that I abstract a particular characteristic from these elements, one that they have in common, and this characteristic will then be the concept. It will represent the unity of all the elements that possess this characteristic. Thus, by subsuming them all under this concept, by saying that A is everything that is comprehended in this unity, I necessarily include countless characteristics that are not integrated into the individual elements contained in this concept. The concept is always less than what is subsumed under it. When a B is defined as an A, it is always also different from and more than the A, the concept under which it is subsumed by way of a predicative judgment. On the other hand, however, in a sense, every concept is at the same time more than the characteristics that are subsumed under it. If, for example, I think and speak of freedom, this concept is not simply the unity of the characteristics of all the individuals who can be defined as free on the basis of a formal freedom within a given constitution. Rather, in a situation in which people are guaranteed the freedom to exercise a profession or to enjoy their basic rights or whatever, the concept of freedom contains a pointer to something that goes well beyond those specific freedoms without our necessarily realizing what this additional element amounts to. This situation, that the concept is always both more and less than the elements included in it, is not irrational or random. It is a situation that philosophical theory or philosophical critique can and must define in detail. Now you may well say this discrepancy is not necessarily a contradiction, but I believe that it offers us a first insight into the necessity of dialectical thinking. Any such predicative judgment that A is B, that A equals B, contains a highly emphatic claim. It is implied, firstly, that A and B are truly identical. Their non-identity not only does not become manifest, if it does manifest itself, then according to the traditional rules of logic, predicative logic, that identity is disputed. Or else we say the proposition A equals B is self-contradictory, because our experience and our perception tell us that B is not A. Thus, because the forms of our logic practice this coercion on identity, whatever resists this coercion necessarily assumes the character of a contradiction. If, therefore, as I observed at the outset, the concept of contradiction plays such a central role in a negative dialectics, the explanation for it is to be found in the structure of logical thought itself, which is defined by many logicians, though not in the way it operates in the various current trends in mathematical logic, by the validity of the law of contradiction. And what this means then is that everything that contradicts itself is to be excluded from logic and, in fact, everything that does not fit in with this positing of identity does contradict itself. Thus, the fact that our entire logic, and hence our entire thinking, is built upon this concept of contradiction or its denial, is what justifies us in treating the concept of contradiction as a central concept in a dialectics and in subjecting it to further analysis. However, that is only one side of the matter, and the fact that the question has two sides will enable the connoisseurs among you to identify without much difficulty a number of Hegelian motifs that have been extended and altered. And this side is the subjective aspect of dialectics, the aspect that is not the decisive one in the final analysis. Thus, for dialectical thought, in the sense in which the category of contradiction is central, what is needed is the structure of the concept and the relation of the concept to the thing it stands for. But to say this is also to imply the converse, namely objective reality, the sphere of the object, if, like the naive realists, you can for a moment entertain the notion of a sphere of objectivity that is independent of thought. The model for this is the fact that we live in an antagonistic society. I shall explain this to you only briefly, because I intend to begin my senior seminar in sociology today with a lecture based on a talk that elaborates precisely this idea. And I do not want to waste our time by saying the same thing here. I shall say here only that the essence of this model of an antagonistic society is that it is not a society with contradictions or despite its contradictions, but by virtue of its contradictions. In other words, a society based on profit necessarily contains this division in society because of the objective existence of the profit motive. This profit motive which divides society and potentially tears it apart is also the factor by means of which society reproduces its own existence. To remind you of an even crasser fact, likewise by way of illustration, it is probably true that today almost the entire economy can be sustained only because a very large part of the social product is devoted to the production of weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons and everything connected with them. This holds good in every country, in both the capitalist nations and the countries belonging to the Russian and Chinese power blocks. This means that the ability of our society to withstand crises, an ability that is generally held to be one of its finest achievements, is directly linked to the growth in its potential for technological self-destruction. I believe that these considerations will suffice for the moment to show you how we are compelled from the vantage point of objective reality to apply the concept of contradiction, not simply as the contradiction between two unrelated objects, but as an immanent contradiction, a contradiction in the object itself. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you may object, and I should like, especially in these first lectures, to anticipate as many of your objections as I reasonably can, and to respond to them as best I may. You may object that this dual character of contradiction, the fact that on the one hand we have a contradiction in the realm of ideas and concepts, and on the other that the world itself is antagonistic in its objective form, that this dual character amounts to a kind of pre-established disharmony. Furthermore, this disharmony is a sort of wonder of the world, a negative adequatio re atque cogitationis, harmony of things and ideas, for which I owe you an explanation. I shall at least make the attempt to give you one, or at any rate I intend to do so. I don't know whether I can keep all the promises I am making. One always turns out not to be able to say all the things in a lecture that one had intended to say. But I have the best of intentions about showing you that the factors that define reality as antagonistic are the same factors as those which constrain mind, that is the concept, and force it into its intrinsic contradictions. To put it in a nutshell, in both cases we are dealing with the principle of mastery, the mastery of nature, which spreads its influence, which continues in the mastery of men by other men, and which finds its mental reflex in the principle of identity, by which I mean the intrinsic aspiration of all mind to turn every alterity that is introduced to it, or that it encounters, into something like itself, and in this way to draw it into its own sphere of influence. This is at the very least a formal indication, a response in advance to the question that I expect, and that I have accordingly posed for myself. Now, if you can entertain the idea, if only for a single second, that there is some truth in these reflections, and that dialectics is a type of thought whose mode of being and whose substance is essentially contradiction, then it becomes clear that it is no arbitrary construct, nor is it a so-called worldview. For if in fact the necessity of contradiction really does emerge both in the object and in thought, in the way I have outlined it to you, it follows that a mode of thought that incorporates it is really no more than an executor, a way of thinking that takes up what its materials make available to it, and that it is not a philosophical position artificially imposed from outside. If I may trail my coat for once, I may say that I think of myself as a Hegelian in that I regard dialectics as the opposite of mere standpoint philosophy. But I am also well aware that simply to protest that something is no standpoint philosophy does not suffice to free it from the suspicion that it might be one after all. For what ideas have not advertised themselves as the very antithesis of standpoint philosophy? What ideas have not claimed that they represented eternal values, vastly superior to particular standpoints? And how very short-lived the majority of these eternal values have turned out to be in the event. Dialectics themselves are no eternal values, far from it. But I owe it to you to show you as well as I can the rigorous nature of the dialectical method, above all, in the transition to a negative dialectics. In fact, this may well be the principal task confronting me. Now, you all know that when we speak of dialectics, in the succinct sense that I have tacitly been assuming, the ancient Greek concept of dialectics coincides more or less with epistemology and logic, and is far more general than what I have been explaining to you. You all know that dialectics in the sense of contradictions both in things and in concepts exists in two major versions. An idealist version which may to a certain degree be regarded as the pinnacle of philosophical speculation, and a materialist version which has been turned into an official worldview that dominates a very large portion of the globe, and as such it has degenerated into the very opposite of itself. And you may well want to ask me why I do not simply declare myself satisfied with this alternative, but choose instead to speak of something else, namely a negative dialectics. You may well ask further whether I am not the kind of professor who tries to brew his own little philosophical soup in the hope that one day he may obtain a chapter to himself in Jeberweg Heinze, or one or other of its continuations. At this point I should like to mention an objection that has been raised by an extremely knowledgeable source, namely by someone from your own circle, someone from amongst those present here today. Given that the concept of dialectics contains the element of negativity precisely because of the presence of contradiction, does this not mean that every dialectics is a negative dialectics, and that my introduction of the word negative is a kind of tautology? We could just say that, simply by refusing to make do with the given reality, the subject, thought, negates whatever is given, and that as a motive force of thought, subjectivity itself is the negative principle, as we see from a celebrated passage in Hegel's Phenomenology, where he remarks that the living substance as subject, in other words, as thought, is pure simple negativity, and is for this very reason the bifurcation of the simple. It is the doubling which sets up opposition, and then again the negation of this indifferent diversity and of its antithesis. In other words, thought itself, and thought is tied to subjectivity, is negativity, and to that extent negativity, and especially dialectical thinking, is negative dialectics from the outset. I should like to respond to this in detail next time. For now, I wish only to set out the problem, as it has been put to me, and to say that it calls for an answer. Lecture 2.